This is Elton Kane for Finextra at Cybos, and I'm here with Eric de Nexon of Societe Generale. Eric, there's a lot of pressure in the industry to reduce settlement times. What's explaining that?
You know, I think there is three different reasons that can explain the call for reducing settlement cycle. I think the first one is mitigating risk, because I think the longer you have an open position, the longer you are in risk vis-à-vis your counterparty. So everyone wants to close the position as quick as possible. I think the second argument is definitely linked to the will of the buyer or the seller to benefit from the result of the acquisition or the sale of the assets. If we have a look at the acquisition, they want to benefit from the property and all the rights that are attached to this property. And I think the third, and I'm not sure that everyone has this in mind, is the necessity for harmonization at regional or worldwide level. In fact, the idea is to say we have to define a reasonably practical standard, and I say reasonable, and implement it at a regional or worldwide level.
So I see there are drivers from a range of different areas, but is there a clear business case?
In fact, I would say yes and no. Why? Because I think we have to consider the current situation and have in mind that you can't have a global perspective regarding this issue for different reasons, because you have to consider first geographies but also market segments. So if I take the example of Europe, for example, in Europe, for monetary products, normally the norm is T+0. So we are quite in a real-time settlement. For bonds, it is T+1, but also T+2 since the reform we have implemented last year in October. As far as securities financing transaction, we are at T+0, but it is at the discretion of the counterparties. So we are definitely able to provide a T+0 settlement. Then after, we are at T+2 for the time being in Europe for listed securities, and I think it is the segment that people have in mind generally when they are talking about reducing settlement cycle. So if we have now a look at geography, in some countries they are T+0, that's the case of China. In Europe, so we last year moved to T+2. It is interesting to mention the fact that Hong Kong, which is very close to China, they are T+2, and they try to articulate the T+2 with the T+0 of mainland. Very interesting, I have heard that 2 days ago in a conference, the fact that the Russian CSD has decided to move from T+0 to T+2. And that in fact shows that T+2 is now the international standard where all the, for again listed securities, to which all markets have to move. So then after we have the question, do we have to go beyond as far as listed security is concerned? From my point of view, considering the experience we have had for moving from T+3 to T+2, my answer would be no. I have definitely some reserve.
So you support an alignment on T+2 for listed securities, even though some areas are moving towards T+0. What makes that move so much more difficult?
So in fact, again, we have to consider the situation and why some are already at T+0 and others are considering that going beyond T+2 is definitely a challenge. So when a market is already at T+0, which is again the case it was the case for the Russian CSD, it is the case for China. It is due to the fact that they have developed recently their infrastructure, and the infrastructure has been designed in order to be able to go directly to T+0. Second argument is the fact that in general it is a domestic solution. So for domestic market, T+1, T+0 is no longer a challenge as far as you have decided to develop your system with this objective in mind. Other markets which are more mature, in fact, have a legacy organization, have legacy processes, and they are maturing as a very good wine, more slowly, I would say, and they are coming from much far than the others we have already mentioned. Every step become more and more challenging, more and more costly. Why? Because in fact you are handling a very, very complex process, and this process is even more complex because those markets are grounded in a more international context. Because we always talk about settlement cycle, but it's not a question of settlement cycle. When you send an instruction, it can be settled in a few minutes. What is complex is to process from the order routing to the settlement all the different steps, including all the various intermediaries which are involved in handling the process, meaning the intermediaries, but also the market infrastructure, etc., etc. And when you add to that different currencies, so with FX transactions and time zone, all that are going to complexify and to make more challenging, reducing the settlement cycle. What we call settlement cycle, which in fact refer to the whole process. And I would say even more, if you consider that T+2 is in fact T+1, because we don't settle in T+1, but we start the settlement cycle at T+1 at 8 o'clock at night, meaning you have more or less 24 hours to prepare the settlement and to go through all this process. So it makes things very, very, very complex and very difficult, especially again in an international context. So then we have to consider the cost-benefits ratio. Okay, and do we have really a business case to go beyond T+1? I say no. And I would like to make a parallel with spatial conquest, I would say. We know that 45 years ago, we sent a man on the moon. And then, since we have limited our travel with men in special vessel to the very close Earth orbit. And why? Because I would say the idea of sending a man to the moon has been developed in a very specific context at the beginning of the 1960s, which is no longer the case. And now, rationality is in the driver's seat. So, at the end, making that parallel, again, I say there is no clearly interest. But that's true that perhaps within 10 or 20 years, we'll go to Mars, and perhaps we'll be able to reduce again this settlement cycle, implementing some new technologies like the DLT, the famous blockchain.
In this complex environment, what is Societe Generale Securities Services doing to decrease settlement cycles where that makes sense to do so, but maintaining service quality?
Okay, in fact, like I would say most of our competitors, Societe Generale Securities Services, we are always involved in following the market trends, identifying the market trends, and working on what could be the impact of these trends on our businesses, but also on the business of our clients, and in our ability to develop, I would say, the most adapted system, operations, offers, services, I would say, for the benefit of our clients.
Eric, that's great. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching.